Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Coming on Zoom tonight. Today we have Evan Weiner, and he's going to talk to us about the early days of radio. Evan, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Paul, for inviting me, and thank everybody who is here tonight. My name is Evan Weiner, and I've been in communications for 50 years. I started 11th grade at Spring Valley High School over in Rockland County. Joe Dionisio, who just passed away, my teacher for English, said, "You have a good voice. How would you like to be on radio?" I want to be in the worst way on radio, and I was. I was on a show called Tiger Talk, the Spring Valley High School show on a commercial radio station, WRKL. Joe also opened the door for me at the Nyack Journal News, which is now part of the Westchester Journal News, Westchester Rockland, and the Bergen Record, which is coincidentally owned by the Journal News today. By 1978, I was on WNEW radio. Speaking of oldies, William B. Williams and all those other people, I was doing some news for them over a 3.5-year period. But I was at WGRC in Nanuet, which no longer exists either. And we did a block every Sunday afternoon at noon, 4 old-time radio shows. Jack Benny's show, and sometimes Burns and Allen, sometimes Inner Sanctum, sometimes Lamont Cranston. Who knows what lurks in the hearts of evil lurks in the hearts of men? Shadow does. Anyway, so that got me interested in that, and I first started really hearing old-time radio back in 1978 when we carried the programs. The most famous radio show of all was probably War of the Worlds, Orson Welles, October 30th, 1938. Gate night, Devil night, the night before Halloween. And basically, what Orson Welles did was take the H.G. Wells book from 1898, War of the Worlds, and made a radio drama out of it. Now, a lot of people didn't listen to the beginning of the show because they were listening to the Edgar Bergen, Charlie McCarthy show, and then tuned in halfway to listen to the Mercury Theater and the War of the Worlds. So they did not get the announcement at the beginning of the show that this is a dramatization. So they actually thought what was really going on was the Martians were invading the Earth. So much so, about 12 years ago, there was a guy over in Nyack. He was around probably late 80s, early 90s at the time, and he was telling me that his father, they lived in Princeton, New Jersey, and what took place at Grover Mill, about 12 miles from Princeton, New Jersey, he thought was real. And he told his kids to go in the garage and get rakes and get shovels. You're going to hit these guys over the head. They're not going to take over from us. And he really thought that Martians invaded. But it was a radio show. And if people listened closely, they would have figured out it was a radio show. Now, Wells himself said, "I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening." And it was part big band and part bulletins. Now, in the 1930s, every city had a big band show. In fact, in Cincinnati, WLW, on Saturday nights, they had a big band show, and the girl singer was Doris Day, who was replaced by Barbara Cameron. I know her son, Doug Cameron. He's an entertainer on ships, and she wrote the Roadrunner Coyote theme song. But anyway, so every city had these shows, and they had shows from Harlem as well. So it was conceivable if you heard a big band that it was a big band show. But there were commercials put in there. And here's Wells after the show explaining just what he did and how he did it. First 2/3 of the 1-hour broadcast was presented as a series of simulated news bulletins. And the CBS switchboard kept getting calls and calls and calls and calls. Local police getting calls and calls and calls to the point where some of the actors who went into the switchboard to answer some of the phones saying, "Hey, we're getting paid for this. This is just a drama. Just a drama. That's all it was." But it had the entire United States, well, maybe not the entire United States, but a good many people in the United States wondering, had the Martians really landed? No, they didn't. But this is who they were going after. Marvin the Martian, complete with the broom on top of his head. And you notice he has no mouth. I wonder how he ever talked. At the end of the day, it was a radio show. But what they did find out was this: radio was important. And radio was basically involved in every home. And it showed just how important radio was. And it was during the golden age of radio in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, if you ever go to Grover Mill, New Jersey, you will find this. The monument to the War of the Worlds with Orson Welles there, the Martians landing. And you could see, I think you could see, people holding each other while listening to this on radio, except for that guy in Princeton whose father told the kids, get into the garage and get your rakes and shovels. We're gonna beat these guys in. Now, when there is no COVID, every October 30th, the night before Halloween, there's a big party, big parade in Grover's Mill commemorating what happened 63 years ago, or rather 83 years ago. This is how people used to watch radio. And when I say watch, now, if I'm live, I'll go around the room when I'm in venue and I will ask people, hey, of a certain age, hey, did you used to watch radio like that? And they laugh. They know exactly what I was talking about because people used to watch radio. In fact, at another place years ago, we were talking about watching radio, and this woman said, I used to turn the lights on with my sister, and we held hands. I was about 7, she was about 8, because the guy on Inner Sanctum told us the best way to enjoy Inner Sanctum was to shut the lights, get scared, and you'll really enjoy Inner Sanctum, because it's the theater of the imagination. You have to imagine what was going on. Television, you see what's going on. But in radio, you had to think about what was going on and you had to pay attention. And one of the things that amazes me about radio, as somebody who's written radio scripts and some television scripts and worked for newspapers and magazines, was just the amount of writing that went into what was going on radio. You had comic strips, you had serials, you had soap operas, even shows like Jack Benny were totally scripted. And some actors went from show to show to show in New York or out in Los Angeles, but it was labor intensive, really labor intensive. And well, I'll talk about Gertrude Berg in a few minutes. That is St. John, Newfoundland. And that is where radio starts. On top of that hill, that is Signal Hill. I speak on cruise ships, or spoke on cruise ships. And you go into the port in St. John's, you see this thing on top there, and that is where Marconi was back in 1901, getting a signal from England to show radio worked. The first transatlantic wireless transmission was from Cornwall in the UK to what was kind of an independent country, Newfoundland, back on December 12th, 1901. Actually, there was nothing between, no landmass between the two, just the Atlantic Ocean, and they just sent the wireless transmission, and it worked. And there's my old Grundig radio, which now just sits there. Because the problem with the Grundig radio is it has tubes. And I have no idea if a tube blows out where I would go to replace a tube for the radio. It's 1951 or so, the Grundig radio. United States Radio was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1912 because David Sarnoff was in the right place at the right time. David Sarnoff managed the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker's department store in Manhattan. He went to his station after he overheard that the Titanic was sinking. And he and a crew of telegraphers were where they were for about 3 days, and they were going back and forth with the people around there on ships trying to save people. And they published the names of the survivors of the Titanic tragedy. Around 1905, 1906, Sarnoff wrote the Radio Music Box Memo, which he proposed the development of a commercially marketed radio receiver for use in the home. And there is David Sarnoff. The Radio Corporation of America gets the Marconi radio station, which was in Wanamaker's, from the United States Navy. Commercial radio would start on November 2nd, 1920. KDKA radio, which 102 years later is still on the air, a Westinghouse station at one point, and it was basically came out of the Westinghouse laboratories in Pittsburgh. It was the world's first broadcast, or the world's first broadcast commercially licensed radio station. The first show, the Warren G. Harding, James Cox presidential election returns. The announcer, Leo Rosenberg. And I'm sure he didn't have a wall in front of him, that magic wall or whatever they talk about, nor did he have exit polls or whatever else. He just read results. Leo Rosenberg starting at 6 o'clock that night. But Sarnoff wasn't really interested in elections, nor was RCA. They were looking for programming, lots of programming, and big events. And the next big event came up in July of 1921. It's a championship boxing match. Heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey against the challenger from France, Georges Carpentier. And it takes place in Jersey City. And this fight is significant in the annals of boxing for a few reasons. One, the sheer size of the crowd. And two, it was on radio. It was the first big boxing match on radio, but not the first boxing match. David Sarnoff, he had it all figured out for RCA to sell radios. You had to have programming. Nobody's going to buy a radio to hear two guys talk back and forth on shortwave, although I might have when I was a teenager, shortwave radio. Anyway, you have to have music, you have to have news, you have to have sports. So he arranged for the broadcast of the Jack Dempsey-Georges Carpentier July 2nd prize fight. The Dempsey-Carpentier contest took place on July 2nd at Boyle's 30 Acres, Jersey City, New Jersey. They just built wooden stands and they crammed in 91,000. It was the first $1 million gate in boxing history. And the RCA people were there. And they put it on KDKA, which really was one station, but it went to the Mississippi, went into Canada, went down to the Gulf of Mexico, and you could pick up KDKA in New York at 1020 on the dial. You still can, but you got some problems with WINS bleeding into their signal occasionally, and WBZ in Boston, which booms into New York at night, bleeding into their signal. And there is Dempsey. Now, Dempsey was kind of an interesting character, kind of a Muhammad Ali character in that he never served in the military. Of course, Ali never served in Vietnam, and he never served during World War II because he was the sole breadwinner for an extended family. And he said he couldn't do it. And so you had half the world, half the United States who were boxing fans like him, and the other half couldn't stand him. Hopes his head's knocked off. But he would win a 4-round knockout over Carpentier. It was a 12-round fight. But the big news for many was the radio broadcast. It succeeded. It had its problems. They lost signals and all that other stuff, but somehow they got through it. Like I said, it wasn't the first boxing match. That was April 11th, 1921 on KDKA in Pittsburgh. It was the first sporting event, 10-round, no decision fight between Johnny Ray and Johnny Dundee in Pittsburgh's Motor Square Garden. Doesn't Johnny Ray he looks really tough, doesn't he? And they got that green thing behind him, or whatever color that was, to make him look like he was standing in front of something other than what he's actually standing in front of, Johnny Ray. August 5th, 1921, first baseball game is on KDKA, Philadelphia Phillies and the hometown Pittsburgh Pirates. The White House decided they wanted radio. Hey, that's Warren G. Harding. He's president of the United States. Warren, you're supposed to face the other way because that's kind of the speaker, and it's supposed to go into your ear, not your nose. But then again, he was one of the most corrupt presidents ever in the history of the United States, Warren G. Harding. Harding installed the radio in the White House on February 2nd, 1922. 2 years later, Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded Harding after he died of a heart attack in San Francisco in 1923, was the first president to broadcast from the White House. It was Washington's birthday, 1924, and it's carried by 42 stations from coast to coast. Again, Sarnoff wants to get sports, and it's the New York Giants and the New York Yankees. And perhaps the biggest name in sports at that time was Babe Ruth. You know, it was Dempsey, it was Ruth, it was Al Jolson, it was Rudolph Valentino back in those days. Those were the big stars. So if you could get a hold of them, you do. And the New York Giants Yankees World Series was broadcast WEF, which is now WFAN 660 on the AM dial. And there is the Babe, and they figured, well, you know what? Babe's playing. That'll draw people to listen. And it did. And Sarnoff, his little radio box there worked. By 1924, the box, the radio, radiola, sold $83 million worth of units. $83 million. Today would be well over $1 billion. The first radio program broadcast from a presidential convention took place June 10, 1924. The Republican convention in Cleveland. Radio's big news story during the two-day convention, the nomination of Calvin Coolidge as the Republican nominee. And there is Coolidge with his car, with a speaker outside the car. That's pretty good. If he's in that car in the winter, the windows are rolled up, he's not going to hear that speaker. The night before the 1924 election, Coolidge made history when the largest radio audience ever tuned into the broadcast of his final campaign speech. Coolidge won the election. In March, Americans listened for the first time to their president take the oath of office on radio. The president was sworn in March because getting east was difficult in January. But by 1937, 33, you could get to Washington in the winter, and they switched that over. Boom, boom, boom. Three little tones of NBC. Sarnoff gets his network. NBC Red, flagship network, with established shows and advertisers, while NBC Blue is kind of a news network, which had sustaining shows. On the Red Network, you might hear radio plays, mysteries, adventures, detective serials, soap operas, quiz shows, variety shows, talent shows. And there's Bill Paley in 1927, WCAU Radio in Philadelphia. He was the one who established that station. It was a CBS station, and it was the beginning of the CBS network in 1927. On the sustaining network, you might hear headlines, remote reporting, sidewalk interviews, panel discussions, weather reports, farm reports. Back in the heyday of WABC radio, when they had Dan Ingram and Bruce Morrow and Herb Oscar Anderson, during that heyday, they used to do farm reports on WABC at 3 in the morning. WABC was licensed to New York. And along the way, I met with a guy by the name of Charlie Greer, who was on the way down after he was at WABC Radio. And I said, why'd you do the farm reports? He said, it was simple. We wanted to keep our license. And the way we kept our license was doing farm reports at 3 o'clock in the morning. Why? Because WABC signal reached out to the Rocky Mountains, Nebraska, and out past Illinois. So they did agriculture reports and things just to keep their license up to speed. The stars, the stars, the stars. Lots of radio stars. Lots of radio stars like him, Edwin, Rudy Valley, Kate Smith. Well, maybe Mert and Marge weren't big stars, but certainly Paul Whiteman was. Burns and Allen. And Seth Parker probably not. The stars. That's what drove people to the radio. People like Gertrude Berg, the Goldbergs, Jack Benny, Mary Benny, Oh Rochester, and who knows? You might hear Toscanini on radio, or George Gershwin on radio, explaining, oh, I've got music and all of that. So it, yeah, I just got Gail talking about the Lone Ranger. I am not going to talk about every show ever, more than thousands of shows, but I'll talk about some of them. Anyway, so you could hear maybe George Gershwin talking about how we put together I've Got Rhythm. And Amos and Andy, show started in 1927 on WGN in Chicago. Two white actors playing Amos and Andy. That would go to television eventually in 1951 with black actors playing the role of Amos and Andy. That show lasted for about 24 years on radio. And Burns and Allen, there's George Burns, Nathan Birnbaum, who got his name from the Burns Coal Company that used to put coal in his apartment building on the Lower East Side, and Gracie Allen, and Fred Allen as well. Herman Wouk, the novelist, was one of his chief writers at one point. And who knows, Babe Ruth might show up and talk about the World Series or a game that he played as well. And Kate Smith, she was a big radio star in the late 1930s. In fact, it was on Kate Smith's show that Abbott and Costello premiered Who's on First in 1938. And Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, of course, if you listen to them and then tuned in to Orson Welles, you missed the first half hour of War of the Worlds. They were competing against each other that night. And The Guiding Light, the Erner Phillips show, which went from radio to TV. And this, of course, is Gertrude Berg is there, some of the stars from NBC, The Guiding Light. She wasn't on that show. And Your Hit Parade, Lucky Strike, Your Hit Parade. And then this is Nashville, Tennessee. This is where the new Grand Ole Opry is, uptown, as opposed to the Ryman Auditorium that is there. And now, well, I kind of talk about the great Gildersleeves just in passing. We'll get to that in a minute. Or the great Gildersleeves, as they said on the Bugs Bunny cartoon. Anyway, the Grand Ole Opry started in 1929, and it's still on. Now, if you go over to Glen Island, and of course the library isn't very far from Glen Island, at the Glen Island Casino, NBC set up studios. Remember I talked about big bands and all that other stuff? Well, NBC set up studios there. And you would get a show from Glen Island, and you might get Jimmy Dorsey and his orchestra, or you might get Glenn Miller, or you might get Tommy Dorsey. There is that sign in Glen Miller, rather that sign in Glen Island. It's not too far from where you could buy concessions over in Glen Island. And if you ever walk through there, read through it. It's kind of interesting. Now, Gertrude Berg was described as the Oprah Winfrey of her day because she was into a lot of stuff. Except Oprah was a performer. Gertrude Berg was more than a performer. Gertrude Berg was a powerhouse. Gertrude Berg was born Tilly Edelstein, New York City, 1898. Her father, Jake Edelstein, ran a resort where Tilly might have been one of the first Borscht Belt comics around 1910. She worked and eventually created and performed skits to amuse the guest children. She, when she was there, met an older Englishman by the name of Louis Berg. He wooed her. They got married when she was 18. She moved to New Orleans. That should have been the end of Gertrude Berg, right, Marlon? For his career as an engineer on a sugar plantation, but fire burnt down the sugar plantation. It was a resort that from around 1910 that her father owned. I'm not sure which one it was. But she and Louis returned to New York. She started to pursue her writing and acting full-time. She changed her name to Gertrude Berg, taking her husband's last name. And then she begins to write radio scripts about a fictional family called the Goldbergs, a combination of her mother's maiden name, Gold, and her husband's last name. And it's about a Jewish family living in the Bronx trying to assimilate into America. And she went out and she did some research on this thing. She's go down to the Lower East Side, talk to the people there, which she would incorporate in the scripts, and probably went to the Garden Cafeteria or any other dairy cafeteria that was around on the Lower East Side back then. And there she is, Gertrude Berg. The Goldbergs premiered on radio in 1929, and she did the role of Molly, but she wasn't supposed to do the role of Molly. She was going to be there only until another actress could be found. However, she was so good that when she was sick for a week, the public sent in mass amounts of fan letters asking, "Where's Molly?" There's Molly. 1936. In 1936, she signs a 5-year $1 million contract with the sponsor, Procter & Gamble, soap opera people, Ivory Soap. And by the end of the decade, she's making $7,500 a week to produce, write, and star in her own series. That'd be about $90,000 a week now. During the height of her radio career, she polled as the second most respected woman in America, behind Eleanor Roosevelt. But she's getting the itch to get out of radio. And there's an experimental station in New York, W2XPS TV or Channel 1, WNBT. And she decides she's going to perform an original sketch on Channel 1. And she's thinking of TV. Eventually, 1948, there's a stage version of the Goldbergs, and the Goldbergs left radio in 1946. The Goldbergs on TV started in 1949. That is Philip Loeb. That is Gertrude Berg. She was the lead writer, star, and producer. The Goldbergs climbed in popularity in 1950. She wins the first Best Emmy Award as an actress. And the Goldbergs was nominated for the Best Kinescope Show. Oh, she also had a line of clothing for housewives. And she wrote a book. And she had a column. She was a powerhouse. Several years later, that's out of sequence. It should be the other way around. The 1948 play only lasted 156 performances. But it was enough to get her on TV. January 1949. She was on TV. So TV did kill the radio star. So she publishes a cookbook, writes an advice column called Mama Talks. Her television show was made into a movie called Molly by Paramount Pictures, Berg on the set in the editing room. And she was the screenwriter and producer. Yet, she was blackballed. She was blackballed from TV and from radio. Why? Because her co-star, Philip Loeb, is a union organizer, accused of being a communist. And she supported him, and she got blackballed. By the way, Philip Loeb committed suicide in 1955. Had no money, had no job, had a schizophrenic son he couldn't support, checks into the Taft Hotel in Manhattan, takes an overdose of sleeping pills, kills himself. NBC not only had Gertrude Berg, but they also had the first network newscast, February 24th, 1930. Floyd Gibbons, one of the best known news correspondents at the beginning of the 20th century, was the announcer. And then there was Lowell Thomas. And Lowell Thomas, was he, I'm not sure who was one of the ones that Jerome Roberts turned into. I'm not sure I could answer that question. But anyway, Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas starts September 29th, 1930 on CBS radio doing the news. Before he becomes a radio commentator, he was a travel adventure writer, and you might have a book or two in the library about Lawrence of Arabia. He is the guy who made Lawrence of Arabia. Now, in the New York area, you probably don't know who Don McNeill is, but Don McNeill was a radio legend. In fact, he was on radio longer than anybody else consecutively. Don McNeill's Breakfast Club was a long-running morning variety show on NBC's Blue Network, and then ABC after NBC had to flip one of its networks because of antitrust laws. His show was originated in Chicago. The program ran June 23rd 1933 through December 27th, 1968. 35 and a half years as a host, the longest tenure for an MC of a network entertainment program, beating out Bob Barker on Price is Right and Johnny Carson. Oh, you know how Stephen Colbert ran for president a few years ago? Pat Paulson ran for president in 68 rather. Yeah, been done. McNeill ran for president in 1948 on the Laugh Party ticket. Alex Trebek hosted Jeopardy for more than 37 years. Why was radio so taken in and embraced by people? Well, Fred Allen, the comedian, who once said about Ed Sullivan, as long as others have talent, Ed Sullivan will always have a job. He's probably right. Anyway, Fred Allen, the comedian, one of the stalwarts of radio's golden age, assessed Mr. McNeill by saying, he's a big, friendly fellow whose good nature pours through the microphone. And listeners react in the same way anyone reacts to meeting him in person. He and the other early settlers of radio established an intimacy that kept their audiences permanently loyal. You got a bond with who was on. You didn't know that person, but you got perceived perception of that person. And whatever you perceived, that's what the person was. As Fred Allen pointed out. And you can say that about a lot of the early radio people. Franklin Roosevelt, before there was Twitter, starting in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt used fireside chats on radio throughout his presidency to address the fears and concerns of the American people, as well to inform them of the positions and actions taken by the U.S. government. Edward R. Murrow, great newsman. Great newsman. Now, wasn't afraid to ask the tough question, which ultimately got him kind of canned at CBS in 1960. With the words, "This is London," Edward R. Murrow brought the war in Europe, starting in 1939, to the living rooms of Americans. His rooftop reports of the Blitz helped define broadcast journalism. Murrow's vivid reports explain the importance of developments in far-off countries, and particularly during the Blitz, the German effort to bomb the British into submission. Murrow brought the violence and emotion of the war to American airwaves. And this guy, John Charles Daly, who you probably remember from hosting What's My Line on TV from 1950 to 1967. He's the guy who told you the Americans were in World War II. December 7th, 1941, radio news comes of age. John Charles Daly reported, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air. President Roosevelt has just announced the attack was made on all military and naval activities on the principal island of Oahu. We'll be back. And then they went into an opera. Then he came back. Then they went back to the opera. Then he came back. So the War of the Worlds being played out, but this time for real. And that is the Pearl Harbor USS Arizona exhibition or exhibit, which I took in 2006, 2005 when I was out in Honolulu, and that's a picture of it. Now, let me ask you a question, and you could put this in chat if you got an answer. Why was Superman allergic to kryptonite? Why was he allergic? And you can type it in as I talk about Superman if you think you have the answer. Superman on radio. The exciting radio adventures of the Man of Steel. The first 27 episodes starring Clayton Bud Collyer. 6 hours of exciting adventures. 60-page historical book. Superman. Well, Bud Collyer was working all over the place in New York. Bud Collyer had gone to Fordham. Yeah, George, partly, but it's not correct. You'll find out in a minute, but you're partly right. But anyway, Bud Collyer is going from radio show to radio show to radio show. He's totally uncredited. After he quits being a lawyer, he had gone to Fordham Law School, became a lawyer, and hated it. So he decided he's going to follow his sister June Collyer into showbiz. And he has a great radio voice. and he gets a lot of jobs, an awful lot of jobs, including 2 on the Superman show. He is Clark Kent, and he is Superman, an octave lower as Superman, 1 octave. Anyway, so here we got Bud Collyer as Superman. Starts in New York and WOR Radio, February 12th, 1940, and heads over to Mutual Radio. I'm an alum of Mutual Radio. From August 31st, 1942 to February 14th, 1949. Okay, Superman has superpowers on Earth because our sun, the Earth's sun, yellow. Kryptonite's sun is red. Kryptonite blocks out the ability or changes the color of the sun. But it also, it's because everybody in Krypton has superpowers, but also its radiation is poisonous to Kryptonians to kill them. Now, the comic strip comes out, or the comic book comes out in 1939. In 1940, the show starts. By 1943, the show is a tremendous success, but you will see the radio show doesn't follow the comic book. Bud Collyer wants a vacation. He's worked hard. He's worked really, really, really hard. And the producers understand that he's worked really, really, really hard. And that, yeah, he's entitled to a vacation. But, you know, the serials go on week after week after week. And, yeah, this is a problem. So they got to figure out, well, how do we solve this problem? This is a problem and we need to solve it. What are we going to do? Well, somehow, if we can figure out something to make Superman sick, all we're going to need is an actor, all we're going to need is an actor that basically is going to say, oh. Okay, but we got to come up with something. So they came up with that rationale. As far as Clark Kent, they didn't need Clark Kent at all. So all they had to do is hire an actor who could moan and groan. And there is Bud Collyer. Bud Collyer with his Superman comic book. So anybody who is anybody in radio had a show. Jack Benny. And that's Al Jolson. That's Jack Benny. That's Eddie Cantor. Bing Crosby. This is a cell from a cartoon about Bugs Bunny, about his life story. And to make sure, to just catch up to speed with the cartoon, Bugs Bunny is a down and out actor. And this is Skid Row, and he's headed to Skid Row. But the end of Skid Row is Elmer Fudd. And Elmer Fudd looks up, Bugs Bunny, you got talent, join my show. And what are you around here with these has-beens or never was? Abbott and Costello had a show. Fred Allen, Victor Borger, Jimmy Durante, whose partner was Gary Moore, who was, of course, the host of the Gary Moore show. I've Got a Secret on TV and all, but it was Jimmy Durante and Gary Moore. Phil Harris, Bob Hope. And there was Amos and Andy and Burns and Allen and Fibber McGee and Molly and the Goldbergs and the great Gildersleeve. See, I got that in there. And him, You Bet Your Life, Groucho Marx. That started off on radio before going to TV. And there was Blondie and Dick Tracy and Gasoline Alley and the Gumps and Little Abner and Little Orphan Annie and Popeye the Sailor Man. And there was this, Captain Midnight's Secret Squadron. And the Ovaltine decoder ring. It's from 1945. And I had a guy who ruined my entire setup about 5 years ago and told the punchline, right? Anyway, so this started with Little Orphan Annie as well. And, send away for your ring or send away for your badge. That's Captain Midnight. The Little Orphan Annie Decoder 1 was a fully functional hand-operated cipher disc shaped like a wearable badge, released in 1936 as a child toy as part of a successful commercial sales promotion for the milk supplement Ovaltine. Ovaltine also sponsored Captain Midnight and other shows as well. Now, I don't know if you remember Gene Shepard. But Gene Shepard used to do a show on WOR, and he had the kid brother, Randy, and he told his story of Ovaltine. And the story of Ovaltine is pretty simple. You got the ring, you would listen to the end of the show, and you did your decoder and all that. He's playing Hangman. And at the end of that, basically, what the secret message was, always drink Ovaltine. That's the Yonkers Library. I don't know. Can I mention the Yonkers Library in the Watchmore? All right. Well, anyway, they have a little Yonkers Hall of Fame. And that's Edwin Armstrong, Yonkers resident, who invented FM radio, but ran into problems. And behind the reference desk in Yonkers Library, you got Joe Lapchick, you got Ella Fitzgerald, you got Sid Caesar, you got Edwin Armstrong, and a whole bunch of other famous people from Yonkers. David Sarnoff successfully lobbied the FCC to have the FM spectrum that Armstrong came up with, 40 to 60 megahertz, to the ones we use today, 88 to 108. See, Sarnoff helped the government in the middle of World War II, became General David Sarnoff, and Armstrong was just a guy who played around with frequencies. And he comes up with these frequencies for FM, and his plan goes awry. He's got radios, he's got a network, it's going to be great. But David Sarnoff said, hey, wait a minute, FM is great, and I could kill the NBC radio network. So he tells the FCC, hey, you know what? Get rid of that spectrum. It's going to kill me. Get rid of that spectrum. And the FCC does, and moves it to the ones we use today. Radio stays the same. It's an old radio. Look at that, old radio. The move occurred on June 27th, 1945, and the Yankee network that Armstrong had come up with was obsolete, along with the FM radio sets that was produced. Now, Armstrong sued Sarnoff for years and years and years, eventually couldn't take it anymore, smacked his wife. He was over in New Jersey, went across the George Washington Bridge, went into Manhattan in a peak, checked into a hotel at the highest floor, and jumped out the window. Sarnoff said, I never killed Armstrong, but Armstrong couldn't take the pressure anymore and killed himself. The writing's on the wall by this point. Television begins to make inroads in 1946. NBC and CBS have TV stations. Alfred Dumont starts a TV network. Radio's on the verge of being pushed aside. And here's the question. Did television kill the radio star? Yes, it did. It killed a lot of radio stars, like Lucille Ball, because they didn't have to work in radio anymore. My Favorite Husband was first broadcast as a one-time special on CBS Radio, July 5th, 1948. Artemis Brooks was supposed to be on, had a delay, so they had the show sitting around. They were gonna, it was an audition program. It was never supposed to be on radio. Lucille Ball and Lee Bowman played the characters of Liz and George Cugat, then Cooper, and there was a positive response to the broadcast, and CBS launched My Favorite Husband as a radio series. Bowman was not available to do the series, so when it debuted later that month, Lucille Ball and Richard Denning, there they are, and Lucy has red hair by this point, not a starlet. She's 37, and she finally gets her big break. My Favorite Husband, written by Jess Oppenheimer, Madeline Pugh, Bob Carroll Jr. Those writers were the key to Lucy's radio success, and the radio show would become I Love Lucy, with the exception of Richard Denning. In 1950, CBS approached Lucille Ball about doing a weekly program on TV. She jumped at the chance. Arthur Godfrey was probably the last radio star. From 1945, or the last one that went on radio, I should say. From 1945 through 72, Arthur Godfrey Time was a Monday through Friday show featuring monologues, interviews, music, and regular vocalists. There was one last stab in 55 rather, network radio, that maybe we could save it because television by this point had just taken over and radio had to reinvent itself. And Talk and Information, Monitor, great show. Gene Rayburn, Henry Morgan was on, Bill Cullen was on, a whole bunch of people were on. It was a really, really good show. I remember listening to it as a kid in the late 1960s. It was fascinating. People going back and forth, talking about books, talking about this, talking about that. It's the birth of talk radio. Monitor makes its NBC radio debut June 12th, 1955, on traditional radio. It's an hour and a half, hour and a half, comedy, drama, variety show. Radio is in desperate shape, and they who are hoping that this would revive radio. Television had stolen just about all radio's audience. It was clear something new was needed and a different direction. Pat Weaver, who had already created the Today and Tonight show on the NBC network, came up with a format so audacious and grandiose that nothing like it had ever been heard. True, it's the beginning of talk radio. End of an era. The Jack Benny Show starts in 1932. Rochester and Dennis Day and Don Wilson and Phil Harris, Mary Benny, and of course, Mel Blanc. Sue, Bugs Bunny. Anyway, it's the end of an era. After 23 years, the Jack Benny Show is gone. May 22nd, 1955. And Mel Brooks is, and what he is, he's a sound effects man and drives Jack crazy, but Jack was always driven crazy. The golden age is dead. A few programs continued, but it was all over but the shouting. On November 25th, 1960, the last 4-time radio dramas or soap operas, Young Dr. Malone, Right to Happiness, The Second Mrs. Burton, and Ma Perkins were all canceled by the CBS radio network. Something else is going on in the 1950s, and it's called rock and roll. And Ellen Freed starts using the term rock and roll in Cleveland, Ohio, and WJW. That's from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Rhythms, blues, jazz, the Moondog House with Ellen Freed, and that morphs into rock and roll. And teenagers begin to love rock and roll. Radio had to change to survive, and it ended up in music, the Sinatra type music with Tony Bennett, top 40 radio, rock and roll, American standards, Gershwin, Cole Porter, and eventually FM. Transistor radio debuts 1955. It was a nice day over at Rye Playland, taking a walk. Actually, it's the Rye Park next to Playland. Anyway, Transistor radio. I still own 5 of those. You know why? Because if you lose power, you lose your phone. If the tower is down, you lose your TV. But you got a battery, you got a transistor, it works. It works. It still works. Transistor radio was the savior of radio. Music and information suddenly became portable. No matter how isolated you were, you could listen to the news of the world. Teenagers could listen to music anywhere they wanted. And that included being far away from an adult's ears. Adults hated rock and roll. I had a woman, I do a talk called The Early Days of Rock and Roll, and we're talking about the transistor radio. And the woman said in 1955, she was about 12 years old, and she said, I got a transistor radio. And she said, at night, I used to sneak into my room, and I put it under the pillow. My parents never knew I was listening to Elvis, or I was listening to Chuck Berry, or Little Richard. Transistor radio helped spark a musical revolution called rock and roll. Teenagers, they wanted their own music. And you know what? Teenagers had disposable income then, and became an important part of the radio audience for the first time ever. They had part-time jobs. They went out, they bought transistor radios, they bought 45s, which were new on the market, and they listened to music and went to sock hops and all that other stuff. There was money to be made. Billboard magazine, Rock and Roll, a Teenage Must, November 10th, 1956. It's money to be made. Rock and roll is no longer a novelty. Its honeymoon period with the teenagers is over, and a reappraisal of its present appeal and future potential is taking place on the station management level. 79 of the 179 managers participating in Billboard's survey admitted that they've had to continually increase the programming of rock and roll due to public opinion. Long live rock. Cleveland 4 years ago, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. 5 years ago almost. There's money to be made. The typical management attitude today is a judicious amount of rock and roll. Time for peak teenage hours is obligatory. While there may have been complaints and alienations within other listening segments of the population because of the excessive exposure of rock and roll, most analysts agree that the current music is here to stay, which meant there'd be a whole lot of shaking going on. It was a little slow to get into cars in terms of FM. 1956 Chevy, that's at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. 1956 Chevy, radios only. AM only. Radio started to have an FM band, including an AM band in the late 1950s and 1960s. And rock and roll made FM band. But the days of the golden age and people slaving over scripts and hiring actors and actresses to be around the microphone were gone. In fact, so are the sound effects guys, because the sound effects guys were the most important people. Golden age, or rather a golden age of radio, because I don't know if you could hear that, but I'm walking up the steps with my hands. And of course, Jack Benny had the vault, right? He had the vault. And you hear all those creaking sounds and all that other stuff. It's all gone. I mean, NPR had a couple of shows like that, but for the most part, Golden Age was history. AM stations have gone off the air in various markets over the last few years, including WFAS, 1230 on the dial. You go to 1230 on the dial during the day, you hear nothing but static. It's now high definition radio, and you have to buy a special receiver for high def radio. The AM band barely clings to life these days. WFAS wasn't the only one to go out of business. Two went out of business. Two radio stations went out of business at the beginning of the year. There are rumors in New York that WINS radio is going to simulcast on K-Rock 92.3, or whatever the station is called at 92.3, because Entercom just isn't making the money that they thought they were going to make. And I was going to talk about that now. Radio stations used to be real estate, not anymore. Entercom got a stock swap. CBS was trying to sell 117 stations, including WCBS in New York, and their station in Philadelphia, and WBBM in Chicago, and KNX in Los Angeles, and KCBS in San Francisco. These are marquee call letters. By the way, KNX, the all-new station in Los Angeles on 1070 on the dial, they are now simulcast in Los Angeles at 97.3. You know why? Most radio stations have little value. Yet radio could be reliable in a disaster. So where has everything gone, including my hair? Well, you can still listen to the golden age radio. There are plenty of apps on this. As my late friend Shelley Saltman, and I know Shelley, you're listening, but no burner phone can reach me from where you are now. Shelley passed away about 3 years ago. He's watching the talk. He says, "You didn't talk about Boston Blackie." I said, "Shelley, I can't talk about every one of them." Didn't talk about Boston Blackie. So I'm a kid growing up listening to Chester Morris, Boston Blackie, and now I go to sleep with my cell phone listening to Boston Blackie. Well, Chester Morris is gone. Shelley, unfortunately, is gone. And local news is gone. This is 1979, Spark Hill, New York, May of 1979. Jack Kemp is running for president. I'm 23 years old. I'm interviewing him. You're not seeing this anymore. You're not seeing this at all anymore. It's gone. It's gone. TV did kill the radio star. That's me in 1971. Well, I want to thank you. Oh, that's me on MSNBC back in 2013. I want to thank Paul for inviting me. And I want to thank you for putting up with me for about an hour or so. And any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours.
Okay, thanks, Evan. That was great. Anyone wants? Oh, let me stop the recording.